In the previous lesson, what we did was introduce John Rawls as a philosopher. We talked about his life, his development, and some of the influence that essentially we can see in his broader works on theories of justice. Now, in this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the grounding of his political philosophy more generally. We'll talk about how he understood political philosophy, how he understood the relationship between political and moral philosophy, as well as what he believed to be the limits of political philosophy. Now, this is sort of a introductory lesson to the methodology of John Rawls, if you will, the ways in which he approaches political philosophy, and then this is a useful way in which we can then start to unpack the application of this methodology into his actual philosophical theories relating to a theory of justice and the ways in which he constructs a theory of justice or constructs an idea for a just liberal society. So, like I said, we're outlining in more detail the political philosophy and the main methodological implications of his work. And it's very useful because essentially what it does is it provides a nice foundation for what will become more detailed lessons in the future, looking at how we apply these methodologies to theories of justice specifically. So let's begin first by talking about the idea in inverted commas, of political philosophy. Because the work of John Rawls is, of course, firmly grounded in the idea of justice, and also the development of a theory of justice, the development of a conceptualization of a just society. And in doing so, he is essentially inscribing a certain amount of normativity in his theories of justice. He's talking about what ought to be the case for constructing a just liberal society. Now, in this regard, what this means is, what John Rawls is doing is seeking to provide and to coordinate practical contributions to what is the general study of political philosophy. Okay, so he's talking about political philosophy, but not talking about it necessarily from an abstract understanding, although obviously he does abstract political philosophy at points within his writings. But he is talking about the actual practical application of political philosophy. Some of the critiques that people often cite in terms of studying political philosophy and studying the applications of moral philosophy is the ways in which it is too far removed from the actual practical application of policy and the practical application of conceptualizing theories of justice. And this can be seen to an extent when we think about the works of, for example, Immanuel Kant, when we look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, when we look at some of the Enlightenment philosophers who really talk about constructing political theories. You could make the conclusion, and you could come to the conclusion, should I say, that they do abstract a little bit too much, and so as a result, it might be difficult to point your finger and put a finger on the actual practical applications of all of these ideas. Rawls looks to take that away. Rawls looks to say, okay, not only are we going to construct an idea of justice from the philosophical perspective, but we're also going to talk about the practical application of these theories of justice. And one of the ways in which this is exemplified in Rawls's writings is looking at this tension that exists between liberty and equality within the context of a democratic society. He understands that where we are talking about the general aspirations of a just democratic political society, we are talking about the fact that there are tensions that can exist between certain aspirational qualities. Like I've said here, the tension that exists between liberty and equality. With this in mind, Rawls develops a number of ideas about what the role of political philosophy ought to be within the broader context of society. What are the useful applications of political philosophy? How do we apply these useful applications? And how can these useful applications be useful in the construction of the just democratic society? And this brings us to this idea of practical solutions to philosophical problems. He sees political philosophy not necessarily as some kind of abstraction of the ideal. He talks about not the abstraction of some kind of utopia that is, like I said, abstract from the concept of an ideal. It is far removed from what could be described as a practical solution. But instead, he is talking about what is described, and how he does describe this in A Law of Peoples, as a quote-unquote realistic utopia. It is seen in the context of being able to provide actual and practical solutions to political questions, and also to political problems. It's all well and good talking about utopian societies and talking about how society ought to be constructed in such a way, barring any kinds of limitations that are placed on it. But if we can't reconcile the limitations that are placed on the society that we're trying to construct, if we can't be pragmatic and practical in our construction of this society, then what really is the point of political philosophy other than to just debate and to generalize and to philosophize in academic institutions? So this is what Rawls describes as one of the main purposes of political philosophy, providing actual and practical solutions to political questions and political problems. He notes that political philosophy was historically seen as characteristic of being able to practically be applied to the real world, and he cites various thinkers in this endeavour. So, for example, he cites Thomas Hobbes and the magnum opus that Thomas Hobbes wrote, which is, of course, Leviathan, as being a response to a practical thing that happens. And if you read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, you have to contextualize Thomas Hobbes' writings within the time period in which he was writing and what he was writing about and what he was writing in response to. Thomas Hobbes famously experienced and went through the English Civil War and the revolutions against the monarchy, against the monarch of King Charles I, the restoration of the monarchy, the republic that was established, all of these different things. And all of those different things informs his views and his understandings in a great amount of detail, especially when we talk about how Thomas Hobbes conceptualizes the nature of the sovereign and the nature of the submission to a sovereign and the nature of the idea of the state of nature and the idea that the state of nature is quote-unquote nasty, brutish and short, the very famous quote that is often taken from Hobbes' Leviathan. So this example that Rawls draws upon is this example of, well, Thomas Hobbes is conceptualizing political philosophy. Leviathan is an incredibly step-by-step, convincing way in which one can write a piece of philosophy. But he does so in a way that is conceptualizing and founding the understanding of practical issues that took place at the time, the English Civil War, the nature of revolution. And so that's a good example that he cited. We can also understand the work of people like John Locke as through and within the context of US wars of independence. You can, to an extent, conceptualize some of the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau through the lens of the Enlightenment movements that take place, and of course the fact that Rousseau was living in and around, not necessarily exactly in and around the overthrow of monarchy, the French Revolution, the establishment of a republic, the establishment of and the rise of Napoleon, and all these different things as well. All of these things feed into these ideas that we have to think about. Edmund Burke very famously wrote a piece on the evils of revolution, and this is seen to be a very fundamental and foundational concept within modern conservative ideology, at least lowercase c conservatism. And so with all this in mind, it is useful to view these kinds of philosophies through the lenses of the historical events in which they are written and tried to attempt to solve. It doesn't make much sense to examine, like I've said earlier, the works of Thomas Hobbes without reference to the fact that he was writing in response to and during the English Civil War. Rawls also understands political philosophy as a way of applying moral philosophical ideas, moral normative claims. So he understands political philosophy as moral application. A common theory, which is often cited in conjunction with that of people like utilitarian thinkers, is this idea that political philosophy is just part of a broader subset which would fall under the umbrella of applied ethics. You can, if you think about political philosophy, understand it to be an example or an exercise in applied ethics. Rawls doesn't necessarily accept the interpretation in that kind of way. Rather, he takes the view that theorizing political philosophy ought to be done within the domain of the strictly political. And what is quite interesting is Rawls takes a view that is quite antithetical to the ideas that we see within utilitarianism. He suggests that the correct regulative principle for everything or for anything depends on the nature of that thing. We see this in A Theory of Justice, page 29. And so, as a result of this, he doesn't like the idea of necessarily abstracting political philosophy as a broader moral application and as a broader understanding of ethics. He's actually very critical of utilitarianism in this regard. But instead, he views that we should take political philosophy to depend on the nature of the thing. So if we're thinking and theorizing about political philosophy, we're theorizing about politics. We're theorizing about things that are necessarily political. We're not going to try and abstract these things to other ideas. And so with this in mind, and given the context that we have of the political being clearly defined, what Rawls notes is the idea that political philosophy plays an important role in the examination of what he describes as the limits of possibility. So essentially, Rawls suggests that political philosophy is a useful tool for one to engage in the imagination of probing beyond what is seen as politically possible. And this is really where we start to see a contrast between how he understands political philosophy to be the practical application, which is what we saw earlier on in earlier slides, but then also, given the fact that we're talking about a practical application, and given the fact that Rawls is constantly making reference to the fact that we're trying to construct what he describes as a realistic utopia, not just a utopia, he also understands political philosophy as being a way of imagining beyond some of the limitations that are constructed within politics itself. Because one question you might be able to ask is, if political philosophy is imagining the practical and the pragmatic attempts to construct a society, aren't we just doing political theory? Aren't we just doing politics at that point? Well, what Rawls would say in response to that is we're being pragmatic, we're being realistic in our understandings, we're not going so far beyond the construction of a utopia that it ceases to have any kind of meaning, but we're also making sure that we're using political philosophy for imagining a world that is this realistic utopia. And with these sort of pseudo-methodological frameworks in mind, we can now, in the next lesson and the lessons after that, start to construct and formulate a more detailed framework for what he describes as his theory of justice, which is, of course, the center of his work and his main magnum opus throughout his entire career.